Hello and welcome to Crazy Talk Analytics. My name is Will, and today I'll be talking about Visual Basic for Applications, or VBA. More specifically, we'll be talking about how to access and familiarize yourself with the Visual Basic editor, which is where you do all of the coding done in VBA. Excuse me, my voice always gets a little bit hoarse right before I'm about to record. So these are our intended talking points, right? So we want to enable the developer tab of the ribbon, which will allow us to access the editor, show some of the various ways to access the editor, other than through the developer tab, provide a quick overview of the following components of the editor, which is the Project Explorer, Property Window, Immediate Window, and Object Browser. What are they and what can they do for you? Review the workspace settings, so basically how to configure your work environment and saving your VBA project. So this is what I intend to talk about today. Hopefully I'll hit everything, and maybe I'll even hit it in order, but on that note, let's go ahead and jump over to the welcome screen where we have some, I don't want to say warnings or disclaimers, basically what to expect from the session. I think the colors on the screen may change over the next few videos as I figure out what works best. I'm looking at this now and it just doesn't look good. It looked good when I made it, but not so much now. Anyway, I'm not gonna necessarily go through all these, right? So I am gonna kind of go over the intent of the channel and go over these lines in more detail in a future video specifically geared towards this. But for right now, I'll ask that you pause, kind of look at this and see if this is something that you want to continue watching. I'll kind of let you know up front so you don't get too invested. Alright, so if you're still watching, maybe I've piqued your interest a little bit with what I'm about to talk about. So understand these videos aren't going to be short and I'm going to talk a lot. So those are some of the key takeaways from that earlier screen. So enable the developer tab in the ribbon. Well, I guess actually before we do that, let me mention, well, one thing totally unrelated to anything else, which is I'm still working on format and dialogue, so I do apologize. Things seem not so smooth. This is a new thing for me, so just take that as it is. But I just want to talk a little bit about the sort of approach, the way I'll be structuring my content. I may do some videos that do have a structured learning approach towards VBA or Excel or other topics, but for the most part I want to look at things in a practical sense. And what I mean by that is, instead of saying, well, this is how you learn VBA in the order that you learn it, let's do a project instead, and let's do a project, and as we need to implement things, let's go ahead and do what we have to do and talk about it in that scenario or in that case, so we're understanding how it works in a more practical sense. So that's the idea anyway, and we'll see how it plays out. So the first thing we have here is enable the developer tab in the ribbon. So this is our ribbon. It's something that exists in all Microsoft applications as far as I know. We have it in Excel, we have it in Word, PowerPoint, Access. They all have the ribbon that has these tabs that have commands and useful, like shortcuts to commands and features and whatnot, these buttons. So there is a very useful tab when you start getting into coding VBA and such, and sort of developing forms, and that's the developer tab. It doesn't show itself by default, so in order to enable it, you got to go to File, and then you come down here to Options and Customize Ribbon, and then you'll see the developer tab right there. You might see some other tabs as well. So you should see the same thing here. I do have a dark theme, that's why my windows might look a little bit different, so don't let that throw you off. Like, there's a draw tab, which I guess they determine is not too practical in Excel, and I don't think I ever really use it. My Copilot just groaned a little bit. So, and then we have the developer tab right here. So these are some of the things that are in there. So we'll just put a check mark in, a green check mark to enable it. I guess she's saying I'm being too loud. I don't know if you heard that groan. So So now developer shows up here, and we have a button here called Visual Basic. We also have a button called Macro. So we finished the first step, so we're on to the second step, which are the different ways to access the editor. If you hover over Visual Basic, you'll see it says Alt F11. I am on a Windows computer, not a Mac. I'm not sure what the shortcut key is for a Mac. It should tell you if you hover over that. But if I do Alt F11, then the editor will open. And it might look intimidating to some people for the first time, but we'll just make it as less intimidating or as least intimidating as we can. So you don't have to close it to go back to Excel. With this editor fully open, and if you have multiple windows, what I like to do is I like to work with my editor on one window and Excel on the other, but that doesn't work so much for recording sessions. But if you push Alt F11 or your hotkey, whatever it is on the Mac, to toggle in between the application that called the editor, which in this case is Excel, and the editor itself. So you can work in Excel and then Alt F11 and then go back into the editor. I'm not a huge hotkey fan, but this is one. Actually, a lot of the hotkeys that I do use are geared around Visual Basic, so that I think says something. So we also have a button here that says macros. So if we click this button, then we get our macro dialog box. You may hear the term macro referred to as VBA script or VBA code. People will say, it's a macro-enabled workbook, which is something we have to get to in a bit, or that, do you have macros or can you write macros? And that is essentially one for one. It's the same term or the same meaning as writing something in VBA. Now, if you ever work with Microsoft Access, macro is a different thing than VBA. They actually have something in Access called macros, which function a little bit different. They're still automated steps, but I think what they do there is they tend to lean more on the actual definition of what a macro is versus how it's implemented or interpreted in Excel. So and over here, if you actually have code in your workbook, then shows macros in all open workbooks, this workbook, or select specific workbook, which is the same thing as this workbook in this case. So you'll see all those macros here. And those are code sections, sub-procedures usually is what they're actually called, that you can run and initiate certain code. I typically don't use the macro dialog here to execute things, but we can take a look at it, try to remind ourselves to look at it later sometime. If you want to create a macro, sorry, this is part of those pauses and they're not too long. If you want to create a macro, one of the things that you can do here is we can say hello world. Now, I'm curious how this is going to do this. I typically don't like to do things without knowing how they're going to turn out, but typically a sub-procedure or some named command, I'll call it a command, but basically a sub-procedure, function, all these things, they're supposed to be one word. So I don't know that this is going to work with hello world being having a space in between and being two words. But let's click create. Yeah, macro name is not valid. I thought so. So what we're going to do then is use underscore to do the break. So hello world like that. And then we can, doesn't like it. Okay, so let's try one more time. We're going to close parent. Okay, we're going to close and we're not going to give up. There we go. So we just closed it and reopened it. Now that create button is active. So we see that we popped into the Visual Basic editor and our script is started for us. This is a sub procedure. It starts with the keyword, I guess you can call it sub. So sub, and then hello underscore world, parentheses. That's where you would pass arguments. We'll get to that point. Not everything needs them, but the parentheses are there as a sort of a placeholder. and then we have our code that would go in between this block. So this is the start of the code, this is the end of the code. And then if we go Alt F11 and then we click this macro button, we'll see the hello world code now exists here. There's nothing actually in there to run, but you can click run and it'll essentially do nothing. When we put code in there, we'll execute that code. And you can also go over here and say options, and you could assign it to a hotkey. So put a description there, say a little bit more about what this code is for. Again, I don't usually use the macro feature. I usually just do my coding in the Visual Basic editor and have other ways to trigger it. But it's there for you, I mean, if that's something that you find useful. So you can click the Visual Basic Editor button, you can push the Alt F11 key, and if you come over here to View, and also a tab in your ribbon, then you'll see a macro button here as well. So you also have the View macros there. I think that's Alt F8, not a hotkey that I use frequently. And then you can record macros. So what recording macro does is it uses sort of like an, I don't want to say AI because it's not really thinking. It is documenting all of the literal steps that you take in the application, in this case Microsoft Excel, and it's translating those into code corresponding to those steps. So it's creating the macro, it's creating that code block, probably assigning it a sort of a generic arbitrary name like macro 1, macro 2, recording the steps in sequence as you perform them, and then saving that so you can call it to execute it again. I guess I might as well. I wasn't intending to do it, but I'll demonstrate how it works. So I'm just gonna, in this particular case, type in. Let's do this. Let's type in let's add a new sheet and type in hello world on it, right? So we haven't done anything yet, so we're gonna say record macro hello _ world, and we'll just put the number 2 at the end. So our macro now is being recorded. We see that record macro change to stop macro. This isn't a bad way for people to get into VBA that aren't familiar with it, but the problem is that you're not really going to learn about the actual programming language or coding necessarily from this. You're just going to see the literal steps that are taken here, but it's not going to let you really improvise or really think on your own. So we're going to come over here and click. I think we have to, yeah, there we go. Click to add a sheet. And then we're going to come into this cell. Right now we're in cell B4, and we're going to say hello world. And then let's, so it kind of clicked out of it, and then we click back into it. So you're keeping in mind every literal step is being recorded. And then I went and I sort of scrolled in. So I'm going to come up here and say stop recording. And then we will view our macros. Now we have hello world 2. And we could edit it. Stepping into it, I think, is it starts to execute it line by line, but we don't want to do that. We just want to do edit. So we see hello world 2 macro. I guess I'm not even thinking about it as I did this, but I think it prompted me for the name. So we're adding a sheet, selecting a cell, and then we're entering the text. And this is all very, very literal. In the zoom, we're zooming step by step incrementally. So if I were to go Alt F11, I'm on sheet 1 now. I can come over here and say view macros, select hello world 2, and run that, and it will add another sheet. And I keep doing this, and what it's going to do is it's going to keep adding sheets and putting hello world in that cell B4. So there's no variability there, right? It doesn't adjust, it doesn't think, it doesn't change the cell that the text is going into, and it doesn't change the text that's going in. There's no conditions or anything like that being applied. So very limited use, that recording macros just the way it is. I guess I can leave these here for right now. Let's go ahead and zoom out. If you notice, everything happens so quickly though. So these are some of the different ways to access the editor. Use relative reference, that's just if we come over here and we say Alt F11 and we take a look. So that code that gets that macro is the macro recorder, or when we create a macro, it actually is getting stored on this module 1 that was created. So I think, so these cell references without dollar signs, if you're familiar with that, these are relative references. And I think it says here use relative, and I think if we click on that, it tells us a little bit over here, but that basically just changes the reference that's being recorded when the macros are being recorded. Alright, so I think we've covered some of the various ways to access the editor, so let's provide a quick overview of some of these components. My video sessions, I've practiced this a lot. They never really quite go as smoothly as intended, and I always surprise myself with what I end up covering or talking about. Since we're going to be here for a bit, I'm going to go ahead and slide this over sort of as a talking point reminder to myself. So chances are this is what your workspace is going to look like when you first open up the Visual Basic editor. Very similar to this. Now, what you're going to see here in what is the project window may be a little bit different. If you didn't do the macro recording or anything like that, you're not going to have this module 2. Matter of fact, I'm just going to come right in here and I'm going to remove this. I don't need to save it. So it'll look more like this is what you're going to see to begin with. You're only going to have these lines for different sheets for the various different sheets that you have in the workbook. It's a one-for-one sort of thing. And then you have this item, or what we would call an object at the bottom, that says this workbook. So if you notice the name sheet 1, welcome, so these are the order in which the sheets were added, it corresponds to this. This is sheet 1. This is the order they were added. We do have a hidden sheet here, and the text on there is welcome, and the text on here is VBA Basics. So that's what we see here, welcome and VBA Basics. So this is what's referred to as the project window. So essentially what happens is when you start to create code, or you start to do macros or coding, anything in the VB editor, it's going to create this project, and that project, it's going to be attached to that Excel workbook. So this is going to be the same thing if you're doing coding in Word or Access or anything. That project is going to be attached to that file that you have open, whether it's a PowerPoint file or an Access database. And you're going to see that listed in the Project Explorer for, it's going to say VBA Project, and then the name of the workbook in this case is VBA Basics XLSX. And we also see that up here at the top, VBA Basics XLSX. This is the active project. In some applications, like Excel, if you have multiple workbooks open, then you will see them listed here as multiple projects. So it would be this part right here, you would see another line. And then you see Microsoft Excel objects. So it's important to note that there's a distinction between Visual Basic for applications, or VBA, and there's also, by the way, there is also a programming language by itself, Visual Basic, which is more of a standalone programming language that's not tied to an application. So that's kind of the distinction there, is that VBA is kind of, let's say, anchored in or connected to, it's a part of an application. You can't really run it by itself. You can create some amazing code. You can almost create your own programs within an application, but it still lives in that application. But that being said, it's not that application, right? So VBA is not Excel, VBA is not Access, VBA is not Word, it is VBA. What VBA does is it's an object-oriented programming language that allows you to manipulate objects, primarily their properties and methods. An object property is sort of what we consider an attribute or a characteristic. It could be things like size, shape, weight, name. Those are all properties. A method is something that an object does. One of the easiest objects that you might think of in terms of methods would be a car or an automobile. The car accelerates, that would be a method. It's something that it does. You turn on the headlights, that would be a method. You activate that, you turn on the headlights. So what's interesting is methods can sometimes also change the state of a property for that object. So maybe you have the car headlight, the property is on or off. So then you have a method turn on headlight, so that turns on that property. Or you say start car, and then the start car is a method, but when you start the car, it turns on the interior lights and the headlights. So that method is actually driving the properties. We also have things called events, but we're not going to get into that right now. It's a little bit more difficult. So what we're seeing here is Microsoft Excel objects, specific objects unique to this project. So basically these are the worksheets, just called sheets here, but these are the worksheets that are in the project. And then there's the workbook itself as a whole. Now I've always had some issue with this in that personally I think the workbook object should be higher than the worksheets. It should be at the top because you would have the workbook and then all of the worksheets within that, but this is how it's displayed. And you can see that the icons are different. They sort of represent those objects. So if you click on any one of these, you'll see properties for it. So this is the this is the Project Explorer, right? So it shows you different components within the project. But then when you look down here on a selected object, you can actually see properties for that. So we have a name, in this case, a name in parentheses, and that name in parentheses is actually the actual object name reference in code. So if you change this, you're not going to see anything change on the actual workbook. It's confusing to some people just getting started. It was confusing to me, but the sheet 3, it says name in parentheses, but that's actually referring to the name that's not in parentheses up here. So that's actually the object name. The tab name, or the name assigned to that sheet, motivation in this case, is actually the name over here that's not in parentheses, so it's kind of the inverse. Then if you notice here, this worksheet has a property called visible, so this is an attribute or characteristic of that property. And I have a drop down here where it is hidden. If I wanted to, I could make it very hidden, or I could just make it hidden. And these values also have numerical values associated with them. So we see the numerical value, and then we see the actual text to that. So then we have the standard with the name. Some of these I'm not too familiar with. I don't really play around with a lot of these sheet properties personally. Enable calculation. You could disable calculation if you wanted to by changing that to false, so that your formulas aren't automatically calculated. And display right to left. So I guess that would, maybe more Asian or other things that read like right to left, but opposite would be, that would be false, so you'd be displaying left to right. So I guess it's just a matter of how you word that. So that's the properties window. But what's interesting is that, I mentioned objects have properties, so you think that you're seeing all the properties for these objects, but you're not. There's a lot more, and we'll show that. For some reason, they just show these select properties that they figure are useful to you in this capacity. So there's a lot more properties, and then there's also a lot more objects. So we're only seeing a few objects. We're only seeing worksheets. We're only seeing the workbook and whatever else we add here. So let's pop back up to the Project Explorer a little bit, right? So we've seen everything that there is here, but if we come up to insert, we can insert a user form, a module, and a class module. We can also insert a procedure, but that's actually something that you insert into a module. A module is basically, think of it as a workspace or a container that can be in an object. So it can be in one of these objects here, sheet 1, sheet 2. They all have modules. It can be a standalone module, or it can be a class module. So if I were to add a user form, then what would happen is I get a group under my Excel objects, actually not even Excel objects because this form is not an Excel object. It's part of my project though. So if I collapse this, I see my Excel objects are just the worksheet and the workbook. And now I have a user form, and I can design this. And this is a new object that has properties, as we can see down here. So this is where we start to see more value in the properties. We have things like the font, the size, the color, the height, if we have scroll bars enabled. These are all things that we can set here in this dialog box. And then you can add code to this form to basically make it more advanced, to add more functionality to it. A lot of people don't know that Excel has user forms in it, so you could use these user forms to interact with your workbook and worksheets in various ways. So you have that can appear in the project window, and then you also have a module. So remember, the module was created when we added code using the macro recorder, or we just created a macro. It created a module 1 like we just did here, and it put the code inside this code module. So the thing with a module like this is it's not attached to an object. It's not code specifically attached or connected to sheet 1 or sheet 2, etc. And it's not connected to a user form. Typically, the code you'll put here will have some similarity, some reason for placing it here. When you create custom functions in VBA in Microsoft Excel, you actually do that using a module like this. So you could, for example, I don't want to get too advanced here. Yeah, I'm going to hold off, but we'll talk about custom functions in another video. But basically, you can create functions here that you can actually use in your Excel workbook. Now, those functions are restricted to that Excel workbook, so you can't then necessarily use those in another workbook. There are ways around that, but for the most part, it's kind of going to be restricted. It's just something to think about. And then we have, but it's not just functions that go in here, sub-procedures, just code that you want to execute. But again, a good rule of thumb is to keep it within the same family or the same genre or purpose within one module, because you can add multiple modules. And then we have a class module. Class modules are where things get really fun and exciting, and this is something that I'm going to explore the heck out of, especially when we get into my series about game development, which is where I'm going to try to create a game in Microsoft Excel using VBA, and that relies heavily on custom classes. But you can also use custom classes for a lot of things in your workplace, and we'll go over that as well. And what a class is a class is a definition of an object. So with these custom classes, you define the different properties and methods that an object has, thereby defining that object. And then what we do in code is we create instances of a class that has those properties and methods that we defined. And then we can manipulate them and we can perform actions with them and such. So it's really, really powerful, and I think one of the things that's often overlooked by a lot of novice VBA programmers, people that just get into manipulating the cells in Excel. So let's just go ahead and close these down. So one of the things I'm noticing here is these windows are not popping open full screen. Just something to note. So we have need a little bit of water there. I try this every now and then. I make these attempts. Let me pause real quick. Trying not to pause or edit videos, but I don't think you need to hear me clearing my throat. On that note, I think I need to try a little bit more. All right, I think I got it. So I've made a lot of attempts on starting this channel and trying to keep videos pretty short, and usually I fail and I re-record and I try and I'm never happy with it. So, that's why I'm trying to make this conscious decision that whatever it is, it's going to be. So, yeah, I might get off track. I might not talk so eloquently or smoothly, but we're going to post it and see how it goes. So these are all of the different groups that you're going to have here. You're going to have the Excel objects, which are objects in Excel. Typically, primarily you're going to see this as being the worksheets in the workbook. So when you add more sheets or you delete sheets, these are going to change. And then you have forms, which you're probably not going to use very often, but they are there. You have the modules, which are basically grouping of code that's not associated directly with or not specifically, pertaining to a sheet, a workbook, the user form, a user form, or a defined class. So, for example, let's say that you have a sub procedure that you're going to run, right? A block of code, some script that you're always going to run, but you're only going to run it on the welcome sheet. There might make sense to actually put that code on this sheet. And I'm not clicking on it because I want to click on it when we get into another section. I'm going to hold off on that. I'm doing that purposefully. So let's take a look at this. VBA basics. So we've enabled the developer tab. We've shown some of the various ways to access, and we've gone over the project explorer and the properties window. Do keep in mind that for the class modules, if we have a class module we've defined here, you're not going to have a lot in the property window. And I always forget the nuances of instancing private versus public, or public not creatable. You'd think it would make more sense, but it really doesn't to me. And the only times I ever know to change this is when the VBA editor or Visual Basic editor tells me that I have to for what I'm doing. I also will mention that it's very important to note the names here, that you are using names that make sense to you. Stick with some sort of a naming convention. Module 1 doesn't have a lot of meaning. Class 1 doesn't have a lot of meaning. So that's just something that we'll touch on when we actually start creating some content. So the immediate window is next. And you might be like, well, is this big gray area the immediate window? And no, it's not. So we're going to go to insert, not insert. We're going to go to view. So here's our project window, and here's our property window. Very useful, very common windows. And the immediate window is up here. And voila, now it's down there. This is typically where it appears if you enable it. A lot of these have X's on them. You can close them, and also, and I'm going to regret doing this, you can undock them and you can flip them around. You can put them on separate screens if you want to. You can change the positions. The reason I'm going to regret this is I always have trouble sort of docking it back the way that I want to. There we go, I got it. Usually it just takes a little bit of manipulation. So the immediate window it's a inline command prompt for your code. So basically you can actually enter code in here to be executed. It's not like Excel that you don't push equal sign for a formula that you would in an Excel cell. Instead, you could just say, well, we can't just say, for example, 2 plus 2, right? We're going to get an error message because it's a compile error message. VBA is a compiled code, which means it gets processed by, this is the IDE, the Integrated Development Environment. We'll do something with the code. It compiles it, turns it into machine readable language, and then it executes it. And just 2 plus 2 itself, it doesn't know what to do with that. So you need to add more to it. A very useful command, we'll call it, command, keyword, object, whatever you want to call it, is debug. So debug, it does kind of like what you think it would based on the sound, in that it helps you to debug things by sort of visually seeing them. In this case, it's debug.print. So if I said debug.print 2 plus 2, now we get the response, and it's in line, so it's printed below that. So debug.print 2 plus 2 gives us the value 4. So we can execute code here. You can use this like a calculator, very simple if you want, but you can use it for more complicated things for sure. If I wanted to say debug.print, I don't know why I'm typing that again, hello world. So one thing to note here is that whenever you want to put text in VBA, you need to wrap it with these text qualifiers, or these double quotes. Single quotes also works as well, and there's sometimes a reason why you might want to do one or the other. I just said single quotes work. Could have swore they did. Maybe not in here they don't. Maybe not in the immediate window, but we'll get to that. Or maybe I'm thinking of Python. Maybe single quotes don't work in VBA. So you can do a lot of stuff here. You can actually do pretty complicated code in your immediate window, but you can't. It has to all be one line, right? So there are ways to get around that to make multiple lines of code one line, but it all has to be one line of code because you can't enter something, type something else, and then enter it. It all gets executed one line at a time. So one of the examples of some of the things you can do with the VBA with the immediate window is, so I have all of these sheets here, right? Sheet 1, sheet 2, and sheet 3. And they say sheet 1, sheet 2, and sheet 3, but they're really sheet 4, sheet 5, and sheet 6. So right now I'm on this sheet 3. So let's say I want to select the one that says sheet 1, which is sheet 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the code name here. This is the object name in the code, which is sheet 4. So I'm going to say sheet 4 dot select. And I've selected sheet 4. Now let's say I want to delete hello world in V4. Well, I can say, let's just change this now. I'm going to select that range, and that's what we're doing here. This is all kind of more advanced if you're not familiar with it, but I'm going to say range B4, which is the cell reference, and I do need to put that in text qualifiers there, and I'm going to say, I think I can say clear, and it removes it. So what I've done was I've accessed an object, and this object, it's a cell, and a cell is a type of range. So this here is actually a function which is similar to a property. This is a function that returns a value, just like functions in Excel. So if I were to say equal VLOOKUP, whatever, and it references a range and it returns a value, it's returning that value. The same thing here. We're returning a value of a range. In this case, we're returning the value of the range that's in cell B4. And then we're performing an action. The action we're performing here, the method, is clear. If I wanted to delete this entire sheet, I could do that. I could say sheet 4, and I believe it's just delete. Oh, sorry. Sheet 4 dot delete. Are you sure you want to permanently delete it? Yes. So it's not overriding the warnings that are in Excel. So now if I wanted to delete sheet 5, you can see it's gone from up here. I can do that. Let's say I just wanted to hide sheet 6. I can say sheet 6 dot, and then it's not hide. That's not the thing that we do, and this is where familiarity comes into play. We're going to say visible equals false, so it's not visible, and voila, it's gone. It's still there, it's just hidden. So we can use the immediate window to view results of code through the debug.print, either inline or through code up here, but we can also use this to actually execute code and to interact with our environment. It's a really, really useful tool that will make more sense the more that we use it. I'm going to do an Alt F11, pop this back open, and go full screen. Okay, so now we've done the immediate window, so let's talk about the object browser. So VBA is object-oriented programming language. We're manipulating objects. We're manipulating objects right now, right down here in the immediate window. There's a lot of objects in Excel, like we see over here. This is a Microsoft Excel objects. There's a lot more in Excel than just this. Where is it? It's this little box with what looks like other little boxes going into it. That's the object browser. It looks like the hotkey is F2. That's one I typically don't use. I admittedly don't use the object browser lately as much as I did when I first started learning VBA. Again, this window is not opening full screen, so we're going to maximize this. I'm going to bring this down a little bit here. I feel like I need to, because of just visibility or readability, I don't want to make people squint on their screens. we're going to go to Tools. This is actually one of the other things we want to cover. Don't know if this is going to make this bigger. No, it's not. It's not actually making this bigger. I might not be able to increase the size here. I do apologize for that. So basically what we're doing is we're seeing all the different objects that exist in code. So basically we'll see all the objects that exist in Microsoft Excel, but also VBA objects, keeping in mind that VBA is not the same thing as Excel. They are different. So if I click on this drop down here, it says all libraries. We'll see what we refer to as a reference library or library. So we see Excel, MS Forms, Office. I can't read this one from here, VBA and VBA Project. The VBA Project is the project that you have open. In this case, it's the VBA Basics Workbook. So we have the Class 1, the Module 1, and I think User Form 1. These are all objects in here. It's something that I often forget exists. It probably has a lot more value than I realize. But so these are sort of unique to your project. Excel objects are all the different objects that you can manipulate and control, that you can create instances of and all this other stuff within Microsoft Excel. So there's really a lot here. And if we wanted to, let's say we wanted to add a new worksheet. We were doing worksheets, we were deleting them, we were hiding them, etc. Worksheets are right here. So here's the worksheet object. We click on that and we can see all these different icons with different names. The lightning bolt is an event. That's when something happens, and when something happens you can trigger other code. So you can say we're going to do such and such when this happens. So we call those event handlers. That's definitely much more advanced. What looks kind of like a green eraser being thrown, like an old chalkboard eraser, that's a method, that's an action. And what looks kind of like a drop-down list or finger pointing to a box or contents, that's your property. So this is an event, this is a method, this is a property. And we'll see that down here. Let me just pull this open. So it says it's a property. Application as an application. So what happens is this property returns an application, which is another object. That's a member of the Excel worksheet. Columns are a property. It returns column as a range. So this is telling you the type of object, the class of object. Remember, a class module allows you to define an object. So if we wanted to know what can we do with a column when we return it as a property value, well, we can go to range. And ranges have these methods and properties that we can then manipulate. So a property, an object can be a property of another object. So a headlight is an object that you can turn on or off, and it's a property of a car, just as the car seat is or the car door. So you'll have a lot of things that can have a lot of different properties. And a worksheet, which is why I don't like the way this is structured, pretty sure is a property of a workbook. So if I come over here, so if I said a workbook, then we can come down here and then we can find worksheets. So you'll see worksheets as a plural, it's not singular, and that means it's a collection, and a collection is just a group of objects. So then if you go to worksheets, so basically worksheets is a property of a workbook, then you go to worksheets, and worksheets basically, well, it doesn't specifically say here, but a worksheets will have an index or a number in it that corresponds to a specific workbook, which will then return the workbook. And all of this is, you know, down the road it seems more advanced, more complicated than it is, but we'll try to make it as easily understandable as possible and as relatable as possible. So the Object Explorer, Object Explorer is really great for seeing what objects exist within the application that you're working on. This tells you, gives you a better indication of the full potential of what you can do. And it's better to work within these objects, within this digital environment, this VBA environment, than it is to try to restrict yourself to the macro recorder and just trying to think of how you can manipulate the cells as they are. It's better to think about things in terms of the object structure. If we look at the VBA reference library, then we'll see stuff, and not as much stuff here. And there's a lot of things here that we haven't talked about or won't be able to cover. It's definitely more advanced. So you're not seeing all those classes and stuff. This is mostly your keywords and your commands, etc. Let's go back to Excel real quick. There was one thing in here I wanted to show you, which is I think it's called worksheet functions. I know there are better ways to navigate here. Worksheet function. So this is actually all of the functions that you call in Excel are actually, I guess they're all actually methods of this worksheet function object. So this is a class, and if you wanted to execute some of these functions in VBA, you can do that calling this class. You'll see things in here like VLOOKUP, random, your standard deviation. They're all in here. So, and this is an example of, like I said, you can create a custom function in a module. Well, functions are also defined by code as well. So we can't really explore it and see how it's written. That's not something that you can do here. But you can basically see it tells you argument 1, argument. This doesn't give you a whole lot of value, but it's part of the worksheet functions. It's just more of an interesting fact than anything else, and if you do want to execute those functions, then we'll definitely talk about how to do that in some of the videos, because there will be times where it will be more useful to use an existing function than to define or create your own. Alright, Alt F11. We're just about there. So we're going to talk about, so we did the object browser. So those are most of the useful things there in terms of the different panes and windows that we have. So let's set up our workspace and then talk about saving the project. So this whole thing is our workspace. We won't often have this open. So this is mostly the workspace that you'll be working in. And aside from some of the stuff up you have here, which are probably default, you'll want to configure it appropriately. So if you go to Tools and you go to Options, then you'll see this dialog box and the editor options. Default to full module view. That's what I thought. I thought that wasn't checked because I was getting smaller windows, but we'll see. Okay, so we have our code settings. So this is specific to the code itself. Auto syntax check. I like to refer to this as your gutter, your gutter rails if you were to go bowling. So basically, it tries to keep you in line. It'll give you pop-up window error messages when you make obvious mistakes in your syntax. And your syntax, it's basically the language of code. It's like basically, do you have the wrong verb, object, structure, etc. That's going to be your syntax. It's not so much that the code itself isn't doing as it's intended, and just that it's structured incorrectly. And it's great when you get started, but it can get annoying really fast, so I like to turn mine off. You can play around with it. Sometimes I'll purposefully not type something correctly because I'm still working on it, and if auto syntax check is enabled, then you'll constantly get those alerts. Require variable declaration. So you might see, let's go ahead. So I'm going to actually disable this real quick. I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to open up sheet 1. I don't think I've opened this module yet. Oh, but it's there. But it's there anyway. Option explicit is at the top of the module. And what that means, option explicit means that you have to declare your variables. So if you're familiar with programming or just variables in general, so let's say that X is like the most famous variable, right? X stores some random arbitrary value. So basically, your formula, you can't just say X plus 2 equals Y. You can't just say that. This is totally out of context of everything because we're not in a sub procedure or anything. So let's just go ahead and say so it has no idea what it's doing. So you can't just say X plus 2 equals Y. Even that, it doesn't make sense in terms of VBA. I was just trying to highlight it for demonstration purposes. So here we go. I'm going to force it to work. Gosh darn it. Okay, you can't just say this. What declaring your variable says first is that you first have to say, and we use dim inside of a sub-procedure, you first have to say dim x as what type of value it is, such as a long, which is a long number, or you can say it's an integer, or you can say it's a currency. Whatever it is, you have to declare it first. You can't just arbitrarily use a variable without telling VBA ahead of time what that variable is. Now, declaring what type it is technically optional, but it's good practice. So you could technically say dim x, and what that will do is it will make it what's called a variant, which is an undeclared type, which takes up more space in your memory and could lead to problems in your code. So when you declare a variable, it's good to say what type of variable it is using this as keyword. A lot of this stuff might seem new to you, but repetition, it'll make sense over time. So this option explicit is what drives a variable declaration requirement. And you'll get an error message if you are using a variable that you don't have declared. But the thing is, there's an option here in tools options, require variable declaration. And if you can see, mine's turned off, but I still have this text. And that's because this only, what this does is it doesn't actually enforce the variable declaration requirement as much as it puts this line on these code modules before, basically when they're created. So it's not checked right now. So if I come on over here and I say I'm going to insert a new module. So we get module 2. Option explicit is not there. So it's this module, only this module is not going to require variable declaration. I don't have to do that dim or that declaration ahead of using the variable. This one will. So if you've already created your module and you want to enforce the variable declaration or you want to remove it, you just do it merely by removing that text or placing it back in. It's as simple as that. The code is executed top to bottom. It goes in order. It always reads that statement first, and that's what enforces the variable declaration requirement. So let's come back over here. Okay, this is where I have that. So if I was to have the auto syntax, that was kind of ridiculous for me to try to get back to that specific code, and I were to say debug.print, and I messed that up, I get an error message, unexpected, print or assert. This is what we expected to come over here, and not this prnnt. So that's an example of where that syntax, it'll give you other syntax errors as well. So if I just went over here to options and turn that off, I'm not going to get that message. I can make mistakes as I'm typing, and I'll show you how to check for those syntax mistakes later. So I always recommend require variable declaration to be on, personally. I think it adds more value. It's not as much of a nuisance as people think. It'll help you to write better code. Better, more understandable, easier to follow code. Auto list members. So all of these, I would say leave all these checked. Auto list members will actually populate potential, or will show you the potential properties, methods, and such for an object just by pushing a dot or a period after that object name, which is what you do to separate the object and the property or method that you're doing. It's just like with the debug.print or sheet6.visible. When you push that dot, you'll get the auto list members. Quick info and auto data tips. I think that's stuff like, I just noticed this looks like debug.porn. So again, debug dot, and then I have this is the auto list. If I were to do something like x equals and string, and then my parentheses, I believe that this is the auto data tips, and I think quick info is something where you can get quick information about a value, for example, so you can hover over a variable and see the actual stored value in it. So these are all very useful. And then we have auto indent, which basically says if you have an indented line like this X is, and you push enter, it's going to continue that indent. So right now, if I were to push enter, it continues to be indented. If I were to indent again with another tab and push enter, it continues that indent. So this helps you to write more easily understandable code. Indenting in Excel, or not in Excel, but in VBA, you can tell I'm getting tired, I'm about to wrap it up here. Indenting in VBA doesn't actually serve a purpose other than for readability and for aesthetics. And I've learned that you want to indent, you want to have a reason for indenting, like a continuation of a line or code within a loop, like a for loop or something. So basically, when you're seeing that indent, and I also like to indent within code blocks, basically, like I would start my dim here, so I'd have my public subtest, do an indent. So when you're scrolling down all the code, and you'll see it'll make more sense when we have more on screen. It just becomes a whole lot easier to read. So having auto indent on works. It's very useful. And I also like to, personally, I like to increase my tab width, which is just the number of spaces for a tab from the default 2 to 4. That's a personal preference. It is going to push your text further to the right, but it's going to be a more noticeable tab. And you can do whatever. You can do a 1, doesn't make any sense. It's just like a regular space. 2, 3, you can make it a 10, whatever. It's just how many spaces are going to be tabbed when you push tabbed. Windows settings, drag and drop text editing. So you can just click some words or letters on the screen and click and drag them. I actually don't like that. And when it triggers by accident, I typically get upset. Default to full module view. That's what we have here is the full module view. I thought that wasn't enabled before, but I guess it is. And then we have the procedure separator. That's this line. So whenever you do like public sub or a function or whatever, it doesn't have to be specifically a procedure. It'll put a visual line separating your code blocks. If you turn that off, that line disappears. And these other things, I don't really play around with them. I do play around with the editor, and you might see at one point all of a sudden my Visual Basic editor will look drastically different. I definitely like to increase my font sizes to make things easier to read for people. Just going to go ahead. I think 18 might work for the videos. Unfortunately, I have only so much control over things like the project and properties window. They do not scale, so I just have to work with what I can there. I think we're just about done. I thought we were doing good when we were at the half-hour mark, but now we're double that. Okay, so saving your workspace. So you've done all your, actually there's one more thing I wanted to show you. So if you don't have the auto syntax check enabled, the way you would check your syntax or your code for those easy errors, those easy syntax errors, is you would click on debug over here and compile VBA project. And what that does is it goes through and it tries to do that compilation or that, translating your code into that machine readable language. If it finds any problems, or if there are any problems, it will find them during that process and it will notify you. So you always want to click that compile VBA project and it will tell you if there's an issue or not. And one more thing, so we haven't really gotten into writing code except for some stuff down here, but you may have noticed once or twice I may have done this. You do comments in VBA with the single apostrophe or single quote, which I guess is an apostrophe. That line is not going to be executed. It's not going to be interpreted by your compiler. It sees that as a comment and it just sort of gets skipped. This is just for you to see, for you to drop notes to yourself or to other people to know what's going on with your code. If I do debug.print or debug.compile VBA project, that does not get read. If I do it now that it's not a comment, I see the red text and I will get an error. So expected expression. It has no idea what's going on here. It's just taking a best guess. All right, and you can save your progress here. Save VBA Basics as XLSX. and all that stuff here. You could a lot more options in terms of importing, exporting code modules, classes, and whatnot. Those aren't things that we're going to be getting into right now. You can play around with that. But over here is where you really want to make sure that you're doing your save for the actual workbook. And what you want to do for a workbook that has code, that has VBA in it, and actually let's try this before we actually change. Let's say save. Yeah. The following features cannot be saved in a macro-free workbook. Again, we have that term, that word macro for VBA, so that's what it's referencing. VBA project. To save a file with these features, click no, then choose a macro-enabled type in the type list. So what you have to do is you have to do save as, and then you have to select Excel macro-enabled workbook.xlsm. And now you can save it. You won't get the error message. And now, right at the end, hold on. I don't know how people could talk for so long. So now when you open this up, that code that you have, and we don't really have any, we do have some modules and classes are mostly blank. All of that stuff will be stored in that XLSM workbook. If you don't convert it to an XLSM workbook, and you go to save, and then you might see me, I might make that mistake sometimes. I might start a project, be like 3 hours into it, because I haven't actually saved it on my computer, and it's still an XLSX workbook. If you've done that and you tried to close it and save it, it's going to prompt you to convert it to an XLSM file. Just go ahead and do that, because if you don't, she's telling me my time's up. If you don't do that, then you're going to lose all the work that you've done. All right. Actually, I think having my four-legged co-pilot in the room with me is actually making this a little bit more interesting, at least on my end, with the vocals. I don't know how well you can hear that, if you can hear that at all. But yeah, we're gonna call that. Yeah, I not the smoothest first recording, but hopefully somewhat useful. Hopefully I gave you some good information that you didn't get anywhere else in the 5-minute videos. Feel free to comment. Feel free to, I'm going to say it was a like, follow, subscribe. I know it's still early. I got to push myself to make content. I'm going to try to do that. I think when I see more viewers or more interaction, more positive interaction, that will definitely encourage me. I know this isn't everybody's cup of tea. This is long, this is detailed, this is wordy, but hopefully it's relevant. Hopefully it's good information, and I'm just doing what I do and hoping that there are a few people out there that like it. So thank you for watching, and have a good day.